Hi, everybody. It's Friday, November 14th, 2025, and our dear friend, Ambassador Chas Freeman, joins us. Welcome back, Ambassador.
Very happy to be with you, Nima.
Please subscribe and hit like button, helping us reaching more people. And let me start, Ambassador, with what's going on with the case of Venezuela. And it seems that Europeans have some sort of difference when it comes to the Latin America. And with the Trump administration, it seems that they're not the United. At least we've learned that the United Kingdom is not willing to share intelligence with the United States. And here is what Marco Rubio said in response to the policy of Europe.
The European Union gets to determine what international law is. What they certainly don't get to determine is how the United States defends its national security. The United States is under attack from organized criminal narco-terrorists in our hemisphere, and the president is responding in the defense of our country. I do find it interesting that all these countries want us to send, and supply, for example, nuclear-capable Tomahawk missiles to defend Europe. But when the United States positions aircraft carriers in our hemisphere where we live, somehow that's a problem. So I would say that the United States is, and this president has made very clear, his job is to protect the United States from threats against the United States, and that is what he's doing in this operation.
Yeah. Ambassador, who's attacking the United States? Because as though he's talking about attack on the United States, as though Venezuela is attacking.
No, of course, Venezuela is not attacking the United States. It's essentially been under attack by the United States for a quarter century in an effort to overthrow first Hugo Chavez Frias and then his successor, Nicolas Maduro. Of course, what the European objection is that this is a gross violation of international law. These attacks on fishermen and laborers and other people whose names we don't even know, there's been no explanation for this. I think it is, however, very, very significant that the UK, which has been since World War II, has been very much a close partner of the United States in intelligence sharing on all sorts of fronts, should now suspend sharing intelligence on the Caribbean, that is, on movements in the Caribbean. And of course, it was followed almost immediately by President Petro in Colombia, also suspending narcotics in intelligence sharing with the United States. I think the statement that Marco Rubio made shows that he's very loyal to Donald Trump, but it has no resemblance to reality. There's almost no evidence at all of fentanyl coming out of Venezuela. Some cocaine comes out of Venezuela, but it doesn't go to the United States. It goes to Europe and Africa, West Africa in particular. And I want to make a point here, because I think the entire effort by the United States in Latin America and in Southeast Asia and elsewhere to interrupt the supply of narcotics is futile. It cannot work. Why? If I spend $1 on Chinese or some other country goods from which I can make fentanyl, let's say I'm a Mexican cartel, I spend $1, it's worth $500 on the street of New York, what I produce. So there's 500 times the profit in buying the precursor. The figure, I think, for cocaine is 300 times. That is what the farmer who does, there is some cocaine produced in Venezuela. As I said, it goes to West Africa and Europe, not to the United States. But if a farmer gets $1, the guy selling the stuff on the street of New York gets $300. So if you have that kind of markup, that kind of profit, there is absolutely no way that you can interrupt the supply. The demand is there. As long as the demand is there, people will supply it. And finally, I just note that there are only 2 instances in history of which I'm aware in which a country has successfully ended an addiction problem. The first was the United States, actually, in after our Civil War, 1861-65, many soldiers who were wounded on the battlefield had become addicted to morphine, which is the precursor of heroin. And so in the 1870s, 1880s, we had a crime wave in the United States by people who had to feed their addiction by stealing things for resale so they could have the money to buy drugs. And we rounded up all the addicts and made them go cold turkey, meaning stop the addiction immediately, despite the pain and the suffering, and in some cases death that withdrawal symptoms entail. We also took very vigorous action against the pushers, those who were selling the drugs. The second instance was China, where the British government deliberately addicted, by the 1949, 10 million Chinese were addicted to opium. Opium grown in British India or earlier in Anatolia and in Europe, and turned and sold in raw form as opium in the Chinese market. The British went to war with the Chinese in order to safeguard their right to sell drugs to the Chinese. Remarkable instance of inverted morality. And the Chinese in 1949 rounded up all 10 million addicts, made them go cold turkey. Many of them died from withdrawal. And they also rounded up the pushers, the people selling the drug, and they cracked down on the criminal gangs that had grown up to supply the opium. So now we have, this is exactly the same situation we have. The demand for drugs, particularly fentanyl, in the United States has fueled an explosion of drug cartels in Mexico. In Mexico, therefore, large parts, particularly of northern Mexico, are under the control of these criminal gangs. And if you go back to the 500 times profit that you can make from something like fentanyl, you can understand why people, why these gangs have the power that they do and the income that they do and the control over Mexican society that they do. But the ultimate cause of this is not the fact that you can make fentanyl, it's the demand for fentanyl in the United States. Many Americans are addicted and many die from overdoses of fentanyl. And it's not, everything Donald Trump is doing is not going to stop this. So the question comes, why is he doing it? Clearly, the drug issue is a pretext. There is no such thing as an enemy combatant because he's a narco-terrorist. This is a completely illegal notion. It is an act of piracy under international law to do what we are doing. So why is he doing it? And the answer is really two things. One is the foreign policy rationale is if Venezuela can be brought down, the Maduro regime can be overthrown. Because that regime is close to the Cuban regime, the Cuban system will also collapse. That's the reasoning. I'm not sure that that is correct, but that is the rationale. But there's an even more important issue here, and that is that the Trump administration has a very anti-immigrant policy. We see ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, violating the constitutional rights of all sorts of people in the United States, citizens and immigrants alike. And this is very unpopular in many places, including in South Florida, where Marco Rubio is from, where there are many Latin American migrants, some from Brazil, many from Venezuela, many from huge numbers from Cuba, some from Nicaragua, some from other countries in Central America, Ecuador, Peru, so on and so forth, Bolivia. And so in order to combat his unpopularity, he is appealing to the Latinos' sense of anti-Maduro anti-communist, anti-Cuban sentiment. And so this is a political maneuver, which has to do, it has its roots in American domestic politics, or at least that's my view.
Ambassador, Maduro and his government they really want to talk with the United States and the Trump administration to make things better, to improve the relationship, or maybe. But it seems that the Trump administration has decided that there is no way of communicating with the government in Venezuela. And here is what Maduro himself said on video that CNN published it.
What is your message to the people of the United States, President?
To unite for the peace of the continent. No more endless wars, no more unjust wars, no more Libya, no more Afghanistan.
Do you have a message for President Trump?
My message is yes, peace. Yes, peace.
He literally doesn't want any sort of fight or war, any of that sort, and any sort of conflict with the United States.
Well, yeah, and I think there's quite a history here, of course. And incidentally, when you asked the question, or you pointed out that the British have suspended intelligence sharing with the United States about Venezuela and about the Caribbean basin, I should have reminded your listeners that there's a long history of conflict between the United States and Britain over Venezuela. At the end of the 19th century, the United States almost went to war with Britain over the border between Guyana and Venezuela, and over the British intention to intervene militarily in Venezuela to collect debts on which the Venezuelan government had defaulted. And the United States firmly warned the British that if they did that, they would be at war with the United States. And the British considered the implications of that, which in their view included the loss of Canada. Again, we come back to Mr. Trump and his 51st state idea, I guess. They concluded that it would be far better to appease the United States than to oppose it. And they withdrew their threats to Venezuela. So there's a long history here. I think it's fair to say that there are, about 8 million Venezuelan refugees scattered all over the Western Hemisphere, some in Europe too, but mainly in South America. Some in Nicaragua, apparently quite influential in the government there, but and not in a good way. And there are Venezuelan gangs operating, of course, that is true. But 8 million Venezuelan refugees, and why are they refugees? First of all, they're refugees because the United States has been trying to make Venezuela miserable with sanctions and other measures against Chavismo, the Hugo Chavez Frias government, and now Nicolas Maduro. But second, because the Venezuelan government has not been very competent. And that is why these two the combination of Venezuelan misery, of those people who have not left, very unhappy, many of them, for these two reasons, American hostility and regime change operations, and second, incompetent government. This is why some Venezuelans actually would welcome an American intervention. I think that's very foolish on their part. It would be a devastating war. But the United States has miscalculated many times on Venezuela. And not so long ago, there was, in the Kennedy era, in 1962, there was the Bahía de Cochinos, the Bay of Pigs, in Cuba. Well, there was an attempt that was called the Bay of Piglets in Venezuela, where some CIA-sponsored American veterans who had been training Venezuelans to overthrow the government attempted to do so, found themselves tied up and on television in Venezuela, and it was a great embarrassment. And why did this happen? Because some people in the United States, and I don't think this includes the intelligence agencies. I think this is freelance anti-Venezuelan operatives think that the Venezuelan people are desperate to overthrow the Maduro government. And the reason you cannot believe that is, first of all, Venezuela has a 200,000 man army, which is loyal to Maduro. But second, he has armed 4.5 million militia members to resist an American attack. They have weapons. If they wanted to overthrow their government, they could do it. And apparently they, much as they may dislike their government, many of them, they're not prepared to be unpatriotic and to overthrow that government. So this is a complex situation. And what Marco Rubio said was actually quite ridiculous, and it missed the point. The Europeans are true to international law on this issue. I don't have much respect for them generally because of their failure to follow international law when it comes to things like the genocide in Gaza or to consider a peace program for Ukraine.
The president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, he said that they want to destroy democracy in Colombia. And it seems, Ambassador, here the same sort of feeling I see here in Brazil. They feel that they're threatened by the United States because the Trump administration has some sort of hatred toward these left-wing governments in the South America, in Latin America. But how far can they go? If they is that serious? Do you think in their mind that they want to go beyond Venezuela if they get something, if they can reach, if they would be successful in Venezuela, then Cuba, maybe Colombia, coming to Brazil, and a social engineering,
Oh, well,
all to change the face of the Latin America?
I don't think there's any plan that's that, I won't call that sophisticated, but strategic in its reasoning. The fact is that the United States, historically, quite in contradiction to our own values as Americans, we have been devoted to democracy until recently, at least, in our own country. But we have been much more comfortable with dictators, military governments in Latin America than we have been with democracy, because democracy inevitably asserts nationalism, and that causes frictions with the United States. So we have a record, yes, of intervention, I think particularly of the Chilean intervention against Salvador Allende. But in your own country, Brazil, we also have a record of supporting military governments and undemocratic regimes because they seem to be more manipulable. And we have, in the background of all this is the Monroe Doctrine, which had two parts to it. One was Europe, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Countries have had revolutions. They are now independent states, and you should not try to reverse that. So Europe, stay out of the Americas. But also, the United States was stay out of Europe. That was the Monroe Doctrine. And of course, at the beginning of the 20th century, we abandoned both of these principles. We began a series of interventions in the Caribbean primarily, beginning with the Panama Canal, overthrowing the Colombian government in Panama and creating an independent Panama, and then a whole series of interventions in Mexico, in Dominican Republic, in Haiti, in Nicaragua, and so on and so forth. And it didn't work. And Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, therefore, I think in 1932, after as he was being elected president, altered the policy to call for a good neighbor policy. And the good neighbor policy was intended to keep the fascist countries of the time, Germany, militaristic Japan, out of South America, And it was, of course, more complicated than that. There were people in both Brazil and in Peru, primarily in Peru, Ecuador, Japanese in Peru and Ecuador, who were arrested by the United States during World War II and locked up in concentration camps in the west of the United States. And there were Germans and Italians taken out of Brazil for the same reason. So this is all very complicated. But the notion that somehow the United States is under attack from this is part and parcel of the Trump narrative. Immigration is an attack, supposedly. Although now he seems to have recognized that we have a deficit of talent in the United States and we need immigration, something that has disturbed the MAGA following rather seriously. They thought he was against immigration. Now he turns out to be for some immigration, and not just Afrikaner or white people from South Africa. So he's been arguing from the beginning that immigration is a form of invasion. Now he's arguing that not subordinating Venezuela means that the United States is vulnerable to attack. And in the background, there's also the issue of oil, which he has mentioned. I don't think it's the main motivation, but Venezuela has the world's largest reserves of oil, even greater than Saudi Arabia. And, he's sort of lamented, well, we could have overthrown the government, but we didn't, and therefore we didn't get all that oil, he said. So this is complicated, and it's frankly delusional on every level.
Yeah. Ambassador, shifting the gear to the conflict in Ukraine, do you think that as time goes by, Europeans would somehow change their mind toward Zelensky and the case of Ukraine? Because right now, you look at the mainstream media, they're all over. They're talking about Zelensky, the corruption in Ukraine. It's not something new. We knew about this all along.
No, I think there is quite a bit of a division in Europe beneath the surface. And that is why you hear so much about so many efforts to inflate the Russian threat to Europe, because they want to have a war go on. They want to fight to the last Ukrainian to hurt the Russians. And that's why they support the deep strikes by Ukraine into Russia, which of course Russia is retaliating against, and Ukraine is going to pass the winter with no electric power in many instances, no heat. So, meanwhile, the Ukrainian army is, it's had consistent problems, but it's now reached a really acute point. The estimate is that 40 to 50% of the members of the Ukrainian armed forces are either deserters, or they're absent without leave, AWOL. The number of casualties per month, plus the number of desertions, is larger than the number of people they can round up and force into the army. And they are now rounding up people and forcing them into the army with no training at all, which means that they're probably dead pretty quickly on the battlefield. And the Russians have very cleverly run a war of attrition, which they've been quite cautious about risking their own soldiers in. There's been all kinds of nonsense published in the Western press indicating huge Russian casualties and no casualties for the Ukrainians. But the opposite is true. And then on top of this, you have the latest, not the first by any means, but the latest corruption scandal involving the people immediately around Zelensky and probably Zelensky himself. There have been repeated, I don't know if you remember, there were various papers from Panama about illegal investment published a while back, and Zelensky was prominent among the names of those who are using that mechanism to salt away money. And we know that his mother has a villa on the Red Sea, and he has other properties overseas and so on. So he's done very well out of the war. as have some of the people around him. And, I know from people who have tried to help Ukraine acquire weapons or ammunition that typically they were asked to set up a front company somewhere else, like Czechia, in Prague or wherever, or in Poland, and funnel the money through there. And the current scandal involves $100 million, which was basically just stolen, nothing done, none of the contracts executed. So this is an endemic problem. We've always known that Ukraine was both the poorest and most corrupt government in the country in Europe. And it is a miracle that modern media propaganda has been able to hold the Europeans behind the Ukrainian war effort for as long as it has. But you have the sense that, of course, no one knows when and if Ukraine's armed forces will fully collapse, but they're in the process of it. And I don't know, at what point there is a shifting point, and Ukraine can't man the battlefield. We just saw Zelensky go down to southeastern Ukraine and visit the battlefield and come away saying, well, we don't have enough men to hold the line. And that's true across the board, pretty much.
Yeah. Here is what Marco Rubio said about the weapons that have been sent so far to Ukraine.
Part of Russia's strategy is to try to collapse morale within Ukraine and the will to fight. So, that's why we've been in discussions with them about defensive weapons to be able to protect their grid. And I know we've been in ongoing technical conversations about the specific equipment they need. But ultimately, if that equipment is ultimately destroyed a week later after it's installed, that remains a problem. And that's been the history of the last 2 or 3 years.
In the last 2 or 3 years, it's all.
That's pretty realistic, actually. I mean, nothing that the United States or anyone else has done has stopped the advance of the Russians and the retreat of the Ukrainians. So, the Russian advance is slow and cautious. But the situation now on the battlefield, as I understand it, is that the Ukrainian troops are so few that there are big gaps between them, and the Russians are able to infiltrate small groups in those gaps and come in behind the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians, the best Ukrainian soldiers who were very good, trained to NATO standards, are all dead. And the people who are turning up on the battlefield are kids with no training. And so this is, this is a terrible situation, and it all comes back to what was the purpose of this from the American point of view, from the British point of view, and some others in Europe. It was to hurt Russia. And some people even had a scheme that they thought, well, they put enough pressure on Russia, it would fall apart into many small countries which could be manipulated at will. That hasn't happened. And in fact, at the moment, the attacks on deep into Russia, while they're hurting the Russians by reducing their oil exports and gas exports, causing damage, are having the opposite effect of what is intended. They're actually rallying Russians behind Vladimir Putin and his government in defense of the motherland against an attack. And not just any old attack, an attack that is linked, in the Russian mind at least, but many would agree, to Stepan Bandera and pro-Nazi Ukrainian elements who joined the Nazi invasion of Russia in World War II. So this looks, from the Russian point of view, it was, of course, the cause of it. I apologize for the noise. That my roof is being repaired, and I can't do anything about the illegal immigrants who are doing it. I mean, I assume they're illegal immigrants. Maybe they're not, but they speak very good Spanish, I discovered. Anyway, at any rate, The effort to cripple Russia has not succeeded. It has crippled Ukraine. And basically, we have abused Ukraine. Ukrainians, for the most part, didn't want to get into this. They were manipulated and maneuvered. And even Mr. Zelensky, whatever you say about him, when he ran his campaign for the presidency in Ukraine, he ran on a peace platform. He said he would go to Moscow and make peace with Vladimir Putin. He said he would implement the Minsk Accords, which would have given cultural and linguistic autonomy to the Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts in the Donbass region. And within 6 weeks, he had been blackmailed or turned around by ultranationalist Ukrainians from Western Ukraine and MI6 and the CIA and the National Endowment for Democracy and others, and reversed course and became very belligerent toward Russia. And he's kept that stance up. But I think it's becoming more and more difficult to sustain.
Looking at the population of Ukraine, reducing from 57 million to roughly 20 million today, how do you see the possibility of radicalizing, the population? What has happened with the case of Al-Qaeda, ISIS in the Middle East? How do you see the possibility of that sort of problem in Europe that could get out of the hands of Europeans, Russians, and make a huge security problem for the region?
Well, when you have the huge number of refugees from a country that Ukraine has produced, many, many young men of fighting age, have risked their lives to leave Ukraine. And there have been polls showing that fewer than a third of those who left Ukraine would go back, even if democracy were restored and corruption were handled. They've made a choice to emigrate. They're not coming back. They're not going back to Ukraine. So whatever happened, I don't know what the numbers are. I mean, I've heard the figure 20 million repeatedly. I see there's a latest estimate from the British, grudgingly saying, well, where there are 52 million Ukrainians at independence, there might be half that many now, 27 million or so. I don't know what the figure is, but it's very clear that Ukraine has been depopulated. And it's been depopulated now. I mean, 2.5 million, 3 million Ukrainians maybe fled to Russia because they were Russian speakers and they sought safety in Russia. Another 8 million or so probably, went to elsewhere in Europe. Total of about 11 million, and a huge number of people have been killed. In this sort of war, even if I think the Russians have attempted, honestly, not to cause undue civilian casualties, but inevitably there are a large number of civilian casualties in this kind of war, as well as the death and wounding, maiming of soldiers. So we know that there are a huge number of Ukrainians who basically have been crippled for life on the battlefield, and many, many more who died.
Donald Trump, when it comes to the Central Asia, he says that it is reconquering the heartland. And how do you see I don't know what's going on in the Trump administration, because every time they have something new to bring up. What is the reason behind this sort of investment in the Central Asia? What are they trying to do?
Well, I think there's several factors at work. Really, first of all, it's absolutely not true, as President Trump claimed, that previous American administrations paid no attention to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and so on. These countries of Central Asia, the independent Islamic Muslim republics that descended from the Soviet Union. There were major efforts made to establish a foothold for the United States there. Why was this? Well, it was because this is a region between Russia and China. And the United States felt it should compete geopolitically. And you referred to Mackinder's theory of, the heartland of Eurasia, who controls this region somehow, controls the world, which I think is a fantasy. But anyway, there is that theory. So no doubt Mr. Trump is aware of that. And somebody whispered to him that there was this theory, and so he's following it. I think the other reason, of course, is rare earths. There's a frantic effort being made by the West, the United States, some European countries, to develop alternatives to China as a source of rare earths and to acquire the ability to process rare earths, which the Chinese monopolize, basically. I mean, ironically, the rare earths that are produced in the United States, that are unearthed, if you will, have to be sent to China for processing because we don't have the capability to do it. So that's a part of this. And of course, there is an interest economically in the prosperity of these countries. Some of them have oil. Kazakhstan is particularly rich in oil, Turkmenistan in gas. And finally, I think we just had this gathering in Washington with Mr. Trump and Mr. Tokayev, the president of Kazakhstan, was abjectly. I mean, he said things about Donald Trump that I would be embarrassed to say about God. This plays to Mr. Trump's vanity, So Kazakhstan actually, quote, joined the Abraham Accords, unquote. I don't know what that means. They already had diplomatic relations with Israel. They're not at war with Israel. They never have been. I guess this is just an effort to please Mr. Trump and try to get more American investment. And if you're Kazakh, and you are between China and Russia, you want somebody else in there to help you retain your independence. Because, the Russians have there's a huge Russian population in Kazakhstan. I think about 40% of the population is actually Russian speaking. And so now if you're Kazakh, you look at Ukraine and Russian concern about Russian speakers in Ukraine, and you think, well, what if they're also concerned about Russian speakers in Kazakhstan, and what could happen, and how do we defend ourselves? So you look for support far away against the near threat. And then, of course, you have the Chinese, who are not a threat militarily, not even demographically, because their population is now declining, but they are a threat economically because they're technologically advanced and better at capitalism than the capitalists.
When we look at these countries in Central Asia, they're so much connected with China and Russia in terms of, the institutions, infrastructure. You look at SCO, BRICS, and even Belt and Road initiatives, Eurasian Economic, Union. They're all connected, so much connected with these two countries, Russia and China, and how I think the United States may find some sort of cooperation with the countries there, but they cannot dominate the Central.
No, absolutely not. It's too far away. The influence of others is too great. You did not mention two very important sources of influence, maybe three. One is Turkey. Turkish construction companies and so on are all over the place in Central Asia. Iranian truckers, people driving trucks from Iran, all over the place. And finally, culturally, all of these countries look to India. They love the movies from Bollywood, the people singing and dancing and so forth, with very nice music. So this is it's a meeting ground, a mixing ground for many cultures. I will say I won't mention which country, but when I was ambassador to Saudi Arabia, the Soviet Union collapsed, and these countries were born, and some of them were pretty shaky, and they wanted money from Saudi Arabia. So they all went to Saudi Arabia with their hands out, and I can remember there was one leader from this region who came, and a friend of mine who was the Minister of State in Saudi Arabia was assigned to escort him first to Mecca, and where he went around the Kaaba and Medina. And then in Medina, he was asked to lead the prayer. And he said to my friend, I don't know how to pray. I never learned. And but he was saying, I'm a good Muslim. You have to help me. So my friend gave him a short course in how to pray, and he succeeded. And then they were on the plane on the way from Medina to Riyadh, and this guy leaned over and asked my friend. He said, "What's the difference between Sunni and Shia?" This is a region which underwent, had a long period, more than first under the Tsar, under the Russian Orthodox Church, which was anti-Muslim, and then under the Soviet Union, which was officially atheist. And they are rediscovering Islam. And their Islam, frankly, has all kinds of superstitions in it, and the sort of thing that Muhammad Abdul Wahab in Saudi Arabia tried to cure in the 18th century. Women tying string on bushes to get pregnant, this kind of thing. So this is a region in transition. Some of them have abandoned the Cyrillic alphabet in favor of the Latin alphabet, which Turkey uses. None of them have kept Arabic script, whereas, of course, Farsi is written in Arabic script, and so is Tajik in not in Tajikistan, but in Xinjiang. Kazakhs and Kyrgyz and Tajiks all use Arabic script, so anyway, it's a region that's been divided by imperialism, and which is now recovering from that, and it's a cockpit of contest between various major powers. Europe is involved in there very much too, as well as an independent actor. But of course, Europe is not very effective because it is so disunited and inconstant in its purposes. The big influence culturally, everybody there still looks to Moscow. They're very much oriented toward the Russian Federation. Economically, they're more and more oriented toward China. But there are big oil companies from the West and the United States and mining operations and so on that tie them to the West.
The new Japanese prime minister recently said that China's use of force around Taiwan could trigger a military response from her government. What's going on in Japan, and why do they feel to intervene in what's going on in China? Because that China has responded that if you dare, intervene in Taiwan, we're going to respond to any
Well, there's a very complicated history at work here. After the Meiji Restoration, which was in the 1860s, when Japan was opened up by Commodore Perry and saw that it had to modernize, the first place that they looked for expansion was Taiwan. And Taiwan at that time was part of Fujian province in China, but not an independent province of its own. The Japanese, of course, invaded, displaced the Chinese from Taiwan in 1895. And from 1895 to 1945, it was part of Japan. And the Japanese Navy ran it. unlike Korea, which was run by the Japanese army. And the Navy was much better at this management. For the first 25 years or so, there were a series of insurrections, rebellions, not only by Chinese in Taiwan, who had been there since the 16th century, but by Aborigines, Malayo-Polynesian people. Interesting about that. Interestingly, Taiwan is the point of origin of the Polynesian people. That's where they started their long voyage to Tahiti and Hawaii and so forth. And those tribes, in some cases, were subject to genocide by the Japanese. They gassed the entire population. But by the early 1930s, Taiwan was pretty subdued, and Taiwanese pretty assimilated to Japan. And so, whereas Koreans had a bad experience with Japanese colonialism, in the end, Taiwanese had a good experience. And so the human ties between the two are quite close. Many elderly Taiwanese speak excellent Japanese. And Japan, Japan is, when it looks around in its neighborhood, Japan finds a lot of people who hate the Japanese because of what they did in World War II, but Taiwan is the exception. So there's a sentimental element here, but there's also a strategic element. When the Dutch invaded Japan and opened treaty ports, 3 treaty ports in Japan, forced the Japanese to open trading opportunities. They did that from Taiwan, which they occupied at the time. And so Japan has a strategic interest in Taiwan. It feels that if Taiwan is in hostile hands, this threatens it strategically. Douglas MacArthur, who was, of course, the American general who administered Japan after World War II, agreed with the Japanese about this, which is why he advocated supporting Chiang Kai-shek and the remnant of the Chinese government that fled to Taiwan. So this is very complicated historically, and Takaichi, the new female prime minister of Japan, is a right-winger. She was an apostle of Abe, Prime Minister Abe, who was assassinated after he left office, and she's been very close to Taiwan, and she's obviously using the Taiwan issue as a political tool by which to increase Japan's defense spending. And this is a whole other story because Japan is hedging. It is dependent on the United States, but it doesn't want to be quite so dependent. So it is doubling its defense budget, and it is now beginning to export weapons. And there is a lot of Japanese weaponry going to places like the Philippines and Vietnam, which is aimed at China. Japan and China are rivals. So this is why this is happening. And you can understand why the Chinese, who lost perhaps 25 to 35 million people in their 14-year-long war against the Japanese invasion of them, would feel strongly that Japan trying to take Taiwan back, in effect, after losing it in 1945, is a threat to China. And here, too, I would say, and I don't want to go on at length there, there's a lot of history that, but in 1944, the State Department, the US State Department, testified in Congress about Taiwan, saying that Taiwan was that if you occupied Taiwan, you could control the entire China coast. And they said it's like if you imagine an imaginary island off South Carolina, you could control everything from Maine to the Mexican Gulf, now renamed the Gulf of America, of course. Um, uh, and so, from the Chinese point of view, U.S. military presence in Taiwan, or Japanese, is a big threat. And indeed, the Japanese in World War II began their attacks on the Philippines, on Hong Kong, on Indochina from Taiwan. So they called it an unsinkable aircraft carrier. That was their phrase, later picked up by the United States. So this is a very sensitive issue between China and Japan. And Prime Minister Takaichi doesn't seem to be inclined to respect the finessing of this issue that her predecessors worked out.
Ambassador, before wrapping up, I want to bring up what Netanyahu said about the independence of Israel on the United States. He said that we don't need US soldiers. We are fine. We fight our own battles. And here is what he said.
That Israel doesn't ask others to fight for us. Israel is the one American ally in the world that says we need boots on the ground. We don't need American servicemen fighting, on the ground for Israel or around Israel. We're fine. We fight our own battles, but in doing so, we also serve important American interests, like preventing countries that chant death to America from having nuclear bombs to throw at America.
Yeah. He's picturing the situation as though Israel is preventing, these countries attacking the United States.
Well, this is standard Zionist propaganda and has been for a long time. And the fact is that it's just as well that Americans, to a great extent, have not been fighting with the Israelis, because look at what's happened in Gaza, where we've become involved in conducting genocide. His thesis that somehow Israel keeps Iran from developing nuclear weapons is absurd. The only reason Iran would develop nuclear weapons is because of the threat that Israel poses to it. So that is nonsense. And to call Israel an ally of the United States is chutzpah on the part of the Israeli. They have no obligation to the United States. They do absolutely nothing for the United States. We Americans spend all our time in the UN defending them against international law and the global opinion, which condemns them. And we give them a lot of money and we give them weapons. And now they're demanding even more money. Apparently, they want a 10-year deal for huge transfers of funds. For what? It doesn't do the United States any good. It just causes us to, it makes Israel's enemies into our enemies. And that is not wise.
Yeah. He's not talking about the taxpayers' money. He's just like what the truth.
No, well, I mean, the transfers to Israel, the official transfers are huge, almost $4 billion a year, but the emergency transfers are many times that, given the fact that Israel is now at war with everybody, with the Palestinians, with the Syrians, with the Lebanese, with the Yemenis, with Iran, and to some extent with Turkey. But beyond that, the Israel lobby, the Zionist lobby in the United States, has built into our tax law all kinds of provisions. For example, if I give money to an American charity, let's say the Red Cross or something, I can deduct that amount from my income for tax purposes. You can't do that for a foreign charity except for Israel. You can give money to build settlements in Israel and take a tax deduction. And so this is much bigger than just the official transfers. And it is not new. The Trump administration's only innovation is that it is absolutely undisguisedly Israel first rather than America first. That is its major distinction. But we've always been Israel first, not America first in our Middle Eastern policies. So Netanyahu is, of course, a very glib, effective politician, and he grew up in Philadelphia, and he can talk like an American and he knows what buttons to push when he does so. So anyway, but I don't. What he said just now is propaganda.
Yeah, the Epstein files are coming out, and his name is all over in the files.
Well, we're going to see those files. They're voluminous. There's a lot of obviously disguised dialogue in them, emails and so forth. But more and more is coming out about Epstein's connections to Mossad, about the penetration of the American elite by his trafficking of young women, girls, this network of pederasts that he created in order to blackmail people. Clearly, Donald Trump is one of those. And so Donald Trump has just done something very typical of the late Roy Cohn, who was, McCarthy's right-hand man. When he's attacked, he attacks back. So he said, well, I demand that the Congress investigate all the Democrats on the list. In other words, don't investigate me. Investigate someone else. Anyway, this is all it's totally disgusting, actually.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Sorry about all the history lessons.
It was amazing. And
Okay.
all of us are learning and enjoying.
Keep well, Nima.
Thank you, Ambassador. You too.